28 тысяч символов. Тема. Что японские летчики рассказывали следователям об американских авианосных палубах? Формат. Forensic Investigation. Язык. Английский. September 1942. A small room somewhere in Pearl Harbor. The man sitting across the table from Lieutenant Commander John Sherby was not supposed to be alive. His name was Hoashi Kazuo. He was 24 years old, a naval aviator from Fukuoka Prefecture, trained at Tsuchiura Naval Air Group, one of the most selective flight schools in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had logged over 800 hours in the air before his first combat sortie. He had flown Zeros. He had attacked American carriers. And then his engine had failed over the Pacific, and the sea had handed him to the people he had been trying to kill. Sherby placed a single sheet of paper on the table. Hoashi looked at it. Then he looked at Sherby. And then, over the next 4 hours, he started talking. What Hoashi said in that room, and what dozens of other captured Japanese aviators said in rooms exactly like it, from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane to Espiritu Santo, would reshape the way the United States Navy thought about carrier aviation. Not because the Japanese pilots revealed tactical secrets, but because of what they noticed. The small things, the procedural things, the things that seemed, to them, almost impossibly efficient. They were describing a machine they had been built to destroy. And in describing it honestly, they were explaining why they were failing. To understand what these men saw when they looked at an American carrier deck, we need to go back to where the two navies started, and how differently they arrived at the same ocean. Part 1. Two doctrines, one ocean. In the late 1920s, both the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy were building toward the same theoretical conclusion. The aircraft carrier would replace the battleship as the decisive instrument of naval power. They reached this conclusion through different paths, and those paths left marks on everything that followed. The American path ran through a man named William Adger Moffett. Rear Admiral Moffett, 60 years old by the time the USS Lexington was commissioned in December 1927, was not himself a pilot. He had never flown a combat sortie. What he was, in the precise technical sense, was a bureaucratic genius. A man who understood that naval aviation would live or die, not by the courage of its pilots, but by the institutional infrastructure built around them. He spent 11 years as chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics fighting for standardization. Standardized deck markings, standardized signal protocols, standardized maintenance cycles, standardized crew rotations. He died in the Akron airship disaster in April 1933, but his fingerprints were on every American flight deck that launched aircraft for the next decade. The Japanese path ran through a different kind of man. Rear Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, later to become Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was himself a qualified pilot, a gambler by temperament, and a theorist who believed that naval aviation was fundamentally about the pilot. The machine mattered, but the man inside the machine mattered more. Japanese naval aviation culture invested extraordinary resources in pilot selection and training. The washout rate at Tsuchiura in the 1930s ran above 90%. The pilots who emerged from that system were, by any objective measure, among the finest aviators in the world. Here is the problem that nobody in Tokyo wanted to say out loud. There were not enough of them. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had approximately 3,500 trained carrier aviators. The United States Navy had fewer, roughly 2,200, but was expanding its training pipeline at a rate the Japanese were not matching. The American system, built on Moffett's institutional logic, could produce a competent carrier pilot in 12 to 14 months. The Japanese system, built on the philosophy of the irreplaceable expert, required 3 to 4 years. Ostanovites na etum. Stop and think about that. The Japanese were building a weapon that took 4 years to manufacture. The Americans were building a weapon that took 14 months. In a war of attrition, which, after Pearl Harbor, was exactly the war they were fighting, this was not a tactical disadvantage. It was a structural death sentence. But in December 1941, Nobody on either side had fully worked out the arithmetic. The Japanese had won stunning victories. Their pilots were better, individually, by almost any measure. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0 Sen, the fighter that American pilots called the Zero, were in several respects superior to anything the Americans were flying. The Zero weighed approximately 2,700 kilograms at combat weight, had a range of nearly 3,000 kilometers, and could outmaneuver almost every Allied fighter it encountered in the first year of the war. The problem was not the Zero. The problem was what happened to the man flying it when the mission went wrong. American carrier pilots who were shot down over water had a reasonable chance of rescue. The Navy had invested heavily in search and rescue doctrine, in part because Moffat's institutional logic demanded it. You had to recover the investment in training. Japanese carrier pilots who went down over water had almost no rescue infrastructure. The philosophical framework that produced irreplaceable experts had not built a system to protect those experts once they were in the water. This is the first thing the interrogation records reveal, and it appears in almost every transcript with a consistency that is striking. When American interrogators asked captured Japanese pilots about their impressions of American carrier operations, the pilots almost always circled back to this point. Not because they were asked about it, because it was the thing that had stayed with them. Petty Officer First Class Tanaka Hiroshi, 26 years old, from Nagasaki, a Zero pilot who had flown from the carrier Zuikaku during the Coral Sea engagement in May 1942 before being forced down by engine failure, told his interrogator at Pearl Harbor that he had counted the rescue vessels positioned around the American task force during the battle. He had counted them because he was doing the math that Japanese pilots were trained not to do officially, but did privately, constantly. How many of us come back? How many of them come back? And the ratio was not what his superiors had told him. Hold that number. We will come back to it. Part 2. The deck itself. The physical reality of an American fleet carrier in 1942 was this. The USS Enterprise, CV-6, commissioned in May 1938, was 246 meters long at the waterline, with a flight deck of 232 meters. Her island superstructure rose on the starboard side. She carried, at full complement, approximately 90 aircraft. Her crew numbered just under 2,400 men. She could steam at 32.5 knots. The flight deck of the Enterprise was not, to an outside observer, an obviously efficient place. It was, by any civilian standard, chaos. Aircraft were spotted in complex patterns, engines turning, deck crews moving in what appeared to be random trajectories, fuel lines snaking across painted lines, ordnance carts threading between parked planes. The noise was extraordinary. The combined roar of multiple radial engines at idle, the clang of the arresting wire machinery below decks, the bark of the flight deck officers' signals. What the Japanese pilots noticed, and this appears in the interrogation transcripts with almost eerie consistency, was that the chaos was not chaos. Meet Ensign Watanabe Kenji, 23 years old, born in Osaka. His father had been a merchant. Watanabe had studied mechanical engineering at Kyoto Imperial University for 2 years before entering the Naval Aviation program. He was, in the clinical language of his interrogation record, technically sophisticated and unusually observant. He had flown dive-bombing missions from the Shokaku during the attack on Pearl Harbor and during the Battle of the Coral Sea. He had been captured in August 1942 after his aircraft was damaged by anti-aircraft fire during operations near Guadalcanal, and he ditched successfully, only to be recovered by an American destroyer. His interrogation at Espiritu Santo ran across 3 sessions totaling approximately 11 hours. The transcript is 47 pages. What Watanabe described, in patient technical detail, was the choreography of the American flight deck. He had observed American carriers from the air during attacks. He had watched the deck operations during his own strikes. And what he described to his interrogators was a system of color-coded jersey assignments, a detail the Americans had introduced formally only in 1941. In which each category of deck crew wore a different color. Yellow jerseys for aircraft handling officers and plane directors, blue jerseys for aircraft handlers, purple jerseys for fueling crews, red jerseys for ordnance and firefighting, green jerseys for aircraft maintenance and catapult crews, white jerseys for safety observers and medical personnel. He had noticed this from the air during attack runs. Reread that sentence. He had been descending at attack speed, under fire, and he had noticed that the men on the deck below him were color-coded by function. He had noticed it because it meant something tactically important. It meant the Americans could reorganize their deck operations under attack faster than the Japanese could. If you killed the yellow jerseys, the flight deck lost its directing capacity. If you killed the purple jerseys, you stopped the fueling. The system was legible from above. It was also, from a Japanese perspective, almost incomprehensibly organized for a navy that had been fighting for less than a year. Japanese carrier deck operations in 1942 did not use a color-coded jersey system. Japanese deck crews were organized by seniority and by unit, in a system that had evolved from the hierarchical structures of the Imperial Navy's surface fleet traditions. It worked. The Japanese carriers had launched devastating strikes against Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Colombo, and across the Indian Ocean in the first months of the war. But it worked because it was built around experienced crews who had trained together for years. It was a system optimized for expert operators. The American system was optimized for replaceable operators. This distinction, replaceable versus irreplaceable, runs through the interrogation transcripts like a thread. The Japanese pilots kept returning to it, in different formulations, without always understanding what they were describing. They were describing the difference between a handcrafted weapon and an industrial one. Now here is the most important thing. The American color jersey system was not a secret. It was documented in fleet training manuals. It was observable by any enemy pilot who survived long enough to look down at a carrier deck during an attack. The Japanese knew it existed. What they had not fully processed, what their own doctrinal framework made difficult to process, was what it implied about American intentions regarding pilot and crew attrition. The Americans were building a system that assumed turnover. They were building a machine that expected its components to be damaged, replaced, and rebuilt. The Japanese were building a system that assumed continuity. They were building a machine that expected its components to last. In a short war, the Japanese machine was superior. In a long war, it was already broken. And if this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of why the Pacific War ended the way it did, not through a single decisive battle, but through the slow, grinding logic of industrial capacity, then stay with us. The testimony gets more specific from here, and more damning. Part 3. What the pilots actually said. The interrogation program that produced these records was not improvised. By the spring of 1942, the Office of Naval Intelligence had developed a standardized protocol for interrogating captured Japanese aviators. The protocol was built around a simple insight. Japanese pilots were trained to resist interrogation about operational matters, unit designations, future targets, fleet compositions. They were not trained to resist questions about what they had observed. They were not trained because their superiors had not anticipated the question. Who had anticipated that a Japanese pilot would be asked what he thought of American flight deck procedures? The answer was a naval intelligence officer named Lieutenant Commander Edward Layton. 40 years old in 1942, Layton was fleet intelligence officer for Admiral Chester Nimitz. He had spent years in Japan before the war, spoke Japanese with professional fluency, and had developed a specific theory about what captured aviators could tell the Navy about its own weaknesses and its own strengths as seen through enemy eyes. It was Layton who pushed for the systematic documentation of pilot impressions, not just tactical intelligence. The transcripts that survive from this program, held today primarily at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, run to thousands of pages. What follows are the specific observations that appear most frequently, drawn from the records of 14 documented interrogations between August 1942 and February 1943. The first consistent observation was about landing intervals. Multiple Japanese pilots, when shown photographs of American carrier landing operations and asked to describe what they saw, independently estimated that American carriers were recovering aircraft at intervals of approximately 30 to 45 seconds between landings. The actual operational standard for the Enterprise and her sister ships during this period was a target of 30 seconds between aircraft in the landing pattern, with trained LSOs, landing signal officers, working to compress that interval further under combat conditions. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the four fleet carriers lost at Midway in June 1942, had been operating at recovery intervals closer to 60 to 90 seconds. This was partly a function of aircraft type, partly a function of deck crew organization, and partly a function of the LSO equivalent on Japanese carriers, who operated under a different signaling system. The difference of 30 seconds per aircraft recovery may sound trivial. Do the math yourself. Over a 40-aircraft recovery cycle, 30 seconds per aircraft means 20 minutes. 60 seconds per aircraft means 40 minutes. In the middle of a carrier battle, 20 additional minutes of deck exposure, aircraft sitting on deck, fuel lines connected, ordnance loaded, is not a marginal difference. It is the difference between getting your aircraft spotted for the next strike before the enemy's second wave arrives, or not. The Japanese pilots knew this. They had done the same calculation, privately, that the Americans had done institutionally. Petty Officer Second Class Yamamoto Seiichi, no relation to the Admiral, was 21 years old, from Hiroshima, and had been a fisherman before the war. He had entered the Naval Aviation program through the enlisted pilot track, which was a different pipeline from the officer track but equally demanding. He had been captured in November 1942 after his Zero was shot down by anti-aircraft fire from the destroyer USS Laffey during operations near Guadalcanal. His interrogation at Pearl Harbor produced one of the most specific technical observations in the entire record. Yamamoto Seiichi had, during one attack run on an American task force, flown low enough over the carrier deck, low enough that his aircraft was in danger from the carrier's own propeller wash, to observe the arresting wire system in detail. He described to his interrogator the hydraulic dampening system visible in the arresting gear machinery housings. He described the spacing of the arresting wires. The American carriers used a series of wires spaced approximately 9 meters apart, with a total of approximately 9 to 12 wires across the landing area. He described the crash barrier system positioned forward of the arresting wires. His interrogator, a Japanese-speaking intelligence officer named Ensign Robert Yoshida, 26 years old, born in Sacramento to Japanese immigrant parents, a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, wrote in his summary that Yamamoto Seiichi's description of the arresting gear was technically accurate to a degree that suggests either extraordinary observational capacity or prior study of American carrier design from public sources. It was probably both. The second consistent observation was about damage control. 7 of the 14 pilots whose transcripts are most detailed made independent observations about American carrier damage control procedures. The observations cluster around a specific incident, the experience of attacking a carrier that had already been hit and watching what happened next. The most detailed account comes from Lieutenant Junior Grade Kobayashi Masatake, 27 years old, from Tokyo. His father had been an engineer for Mitsubishi. Kobayashi had studied at the Imperial Naval Academy at Etajima, graduating in the class of 1937. He had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, flying a Kate torpedo bomber from the Akagi. He had survived Midway. He had been shot down and captured in January 1943 during operations in the Solomons. Kobayashi described, in his interrogation, watching the USS Enterprise absorb bomb hits during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942. He had been part of the second wave attack and arrived over the task force after the first wave had already struck the carrier. What he described was not the damage. What he described was the response to the damage. Within what he estimated as 8 to 10 minutes of the bomb hits, he observed flight deck crews working on the damaged sections of the deck. He observed fire suppression systems operating. He observed aircraft that had been spotted on deck being moved, some pushed over the side to clear the deck, a decision he described as shocking to him, because the idea of deliberately destroying your own aircraft to maintain operational capacity was not something his training had prepared him to observe. He described it as ruthless efficiency. That phrase, in the original Japanese, something closer to merciless practicality, appears in Kobayashi's transcript and was noted by his interrogator as significant. Kobayashi was not praising the Americans. He was struggling to categorize what he had seen within his own doctrinal framework, and finding that his framework did not have a slot for it. The Japanese carriers at Midway had burned for hours. The Akagi, Kobayashi's own ship, had been struck by a single bomb, one bomb, and had been abandoned. The fires had spread because the Japanese damage control doctrine, built around the assumption of expert crews who had trained together for years, did not have the same redundant, systematized response that American damage control doctrine had developed under the same institutional logic as everything else. Assume turnover, assume replaceable operators, build the system to function even when the experts are dead. Here is the most brutal detail in the entire interrogation record. The Japanese damage control crews who survived Midway, the men who had been below decks on the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu when the bombs hit, were, in many cases, the most experienced damage control personnel in the Imperial Navy. They survived. But the carriers they were on did not survive, and the doctrine that had governed their response to the hits had failed, not because the men were incompetent, but because the system had not been built to absorb the kind of rapid, cascading damage that American dive bombers delivered in the space of 6 minutes. 6 minutes, 4 carriers. The most experienced carrier striking force in the world. Gone. Part 4. The forensic verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The interrogation transcripts of captured Japanese aviators between 1942 and 1943 do not reveal a story about courage or cowardice, about superior technology or inferior technology, about better pilots or worse pilots. They reveal something more specific and more instructive than any of those framings. They reveal that the Japanese pilots who attacked American carriers were, in many cases, technically superior to their opponents. They knew it. The Americans knew it. The interrogation records are full of moments where American intelligence officers are noting, with professional honesty, that the men sitting across from them had skills that their own pilots could not match at that stage of the war. Watanabe Kenji, the mechanical engineering student from Osaka who had noticed the color-coded jerseys from the air during an attack run, told his interrogator at one point that he believed the average American carrier pilot he had encountered in combat was not as skilled as the average Japanese carrier pilot. His interrogator noted this in the record without apparent offense. It was probably accurate, and yet Watanabe Kenji was in the interrogation room, not the other way around. What the transcripts collectively describe is the collision between two different theories of warfare. The Japanese theory held that the decisive factor was the quality of the individual, the pilot, the ship captain, the sword master. Build the best individual, and the system will follow. The American theory, embedded in the institutional logic that Moffett had built into the Bureau of Aeronautics, and that had propagated through every aspect of carrier operations, held that the decisive factor was the system. Build the best system, and individuals of adequate quality will make it function. Neither theory was wrong in absolute terms. But in a war that began in December 1941 and would not end until August 1945, a war of 3 years and 8 months, fought across the largest ocean on Earth, consuming material and human resources at rates that neither side had fully calculated in advance, the system theory had a structural advantage that the individual theory could not overcome. The color-coded jerseys were not a tactical innovation. They were a symptom of a doctrine that assumes the yellow jersey who died today would be replaced by a trained yellow jersey tomorrow. The arresting gear system that Yamamoto Seiichi observed at low altitude was not a technological miracle. It was the product of standardized engineering specifications that allowed any qualified maintenance crew to service it, not just the crew that had originally installed it. The 30-second recovery interval was not the result of extraordinary pilots and extraordinary deck crews. It was the result of a training pipeline that produced adequate pilots and adequate deck crews in sufficient numbers that the system could be pushed to its operational limits without depending on any single irreplaceable person. Think about what that means. The Japanese pilots who sat in those interrogation rooms were describing a machine that was designed to absorb their deaths. Every time a Japanese pilot succeeded in killing an American deck crewman, the American system had already planned for that death. The slot had a replacement. The training pipeline was already producing that replacement. The doctrine had already accounted for the vacancy. The Japanese system had not planned for the deaths of its own people in the same way. Not because Japanese commanders did not value their pilots. The historical record suggests they valued them intensely, perhaps too intensely, in the sense that the intensity of the valuation prevented the cold institutional planning that would have protected more of them. The very belief that these pilots were irreplaceable made it psychologically difficult to build the rescue infrastructure, the rotation schedules, the standardized training pipelines that might have made them more replaceable, and therefore more numerous. Now consider Kobayashi Masatake's phrase again. Ruthless efficiency. He was watching the Americans push their own aircraft off the flight deck to clear the landing area. He was watching them make the calculation that the aircraft was worth less than the operational capacity of the deck. He was watching a system that had already decided, at the doctrinal level, that no single component, not the aircraft, not the pilot, not the deck crewman, was worth preserving at the cost of the system's function. Kobayashi Masatake survived the war. He was repatriated to Japan in 1946. He died in Tokyo in 1989 at the age of 73. In a post-war interview published in a Japanese naval history journal in 1972, he was asked what he remembered most clearly about his time as a prisoner of war. He did not mention the conditions of his captivity. He did not mention the interrogations. He said he remembered watching, through a porthole of the transport ship that carried him to Pearl Harbor, the flight deck operations on the carrier that was escorting the convoy. He said he watched for 2 hours. He said he counted the recovery intervals. He said he stopped counting when he realized that the number he was arriving at made the outcome of the war a mathematical certainty. The interrogators who sat across from men like Hoashi Kazuo, Watanabe Kenji, Tanaka Hiroshi, Yamamoto Seiichi, and Kobayashi Masatake were not extracting secrets. They were receiving a technical assessment from people who had studied the American carrier system under the most rigorous possible testing conditions. They had tried to destroy it, and they had failed. And they had survived to explain why. Edward Layton, who had designed the interrogation protocol, understood this. In his post-war memoir, And I Was There, published in 1985, he wrote that the captured aviator interrogations had provided the Navy with something more valuable than tactical intelligence. They had provided, in his phrase, a mirror held up by the enemy. What the Navy saw in that mirror was not always flattering. The American pilots were less skilled. The American aircraft were, in several respects, inferior to the Zero in the early war period. The American carrier commanders were, in some documented cases, overly cautious in ways that cost opportunities. But the mirror also showed something the Japanese could not show about themselves, a system that was already planning for its own losses, already building its replacements, already absorbing the attrition that the Japanese were inflicting, and continuing to function. Hoashi Kazuo, the man who sat across from Lieutenant Commander John Sherby in that room in Pearl Harbor in September 1942, was repatriated after the war. He returned to Fukuoka Prefecture. He worked for a trading company for 30 years. He died in 2003 at the age of 85. In the 4 hours he spent with Sherby in that room, he had described the American carrier system with a precision and clarity that his own Navy's intelligence apparatus had never fully achieved. He described the deck markings. He described the signal systems. He described the rescue vessels he had counted around the task force. He described the gap between what he had been told to expect and what he had found. He had been told the Americans were brave but disorganized, competent but not excellent, a nation of manufacturers, not warriors. What he found, looking down from the cockpit of his Zero during attack runs on the most powerful naval weapons in human history up to that point, was something his training had not given him a category for. A system that was built to win a long war. He had been built to win a short one. The three words that Kobayashi Masatake kept returning to, ruthless efficiency, are not a compliment and they are not a condemnation. They are a technical description of a doctrine. A doctrine that assumed loss, planned for loss, and built its recovery from loss into the operating procedure before the first shot was fired. The Japanese pilots who survived to sit in those interrogation rooms had done something remarkable. They had looked at the machine built to defeat them, and they had described it honestly, in technical detail, to the people who built it. That honesty did not save them or their Navy, but it left a record. 47 pages here, 63 pages there, 11 hours of conversation in a small room in Espiritu Santo. That is, if you read it carefully, one of the most precise autopsies of a military defeat ever produced by the people who were being defeated. If this investigation gave you something that the standard histories of the Pacific War don't, the view from the other cockpit, the cold arithmetic that the pilots were counting even as they dove, then hit like. It keeps this kind of forensic history visible a little longer. And subscribe if you want the next chapter. Because the story of what the Americans learned from those interrogations and what they did with what they learned is a different story. And it is just as cold. Hoashi Kazuo walked into that room in Pearl Harbor, carrying knowledge he had paid for in 800 hours of training and one crashed aircraft. He left it having given that knowledge to the people who needed it most. He never flew in combat again. The American carriers he had described, the Enterprise, the Hornet, the Wasp, the Yorktown, went on fighting for 3 more years. Ruthless efficiency, that was the mirror, and the reflection did not lie.